World War II ended in 1945. Everyone went home, except one man. Hiroo Onoda stayed in the Philippine jungle for 29 years, still fighting, still on patrol, still waiting for orders that were never coming. This is his story. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Kainan, Japan. From a young age he was disciplined, focused, and deeply shaped by the Japanese military culture of his era, a culture built around one central idea: loyalty above everything, loyalty to your mission, loyalty to your commanding officer, loyalty to the emperor. In 1942, at 19 years old, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army, but Onoda wasn't sent to the front lines as a regular infantryman. He was selected for something more specialized. In 1944, he was sent to Nakano School, the Imperial Army's elite intelligence training academy. Think of it as Japan's version of special operations training, combined with intelligence work and guerrilla warfare tactics. At Nakano, he was trained to do one specific thing exceptionally well: survive behind enemy lines, operate alone or in small units, gather intelligence, conduct sabotage, and above all, never surrender. That last part wasn't just doctrine. It was drilled into every soldier at Nakano as an absolute. Surrender was not an option, not under any circumstances. Even if you were completely cut off, even if you were outnumbered, even if the situation looked hopeless, you held your position, you continued your mission, you waited for orders. In December 1944, Onoda was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. He was 22 years old. His orders were clear: conduct guerrilla operations, delay the Allied advance, and hold the island. He was explicitly told, under no circumstances should you surrender or take your own life. He took those orders seriously, more seriously than anyone could have imagined. August 1945, Japan surrenders. World War II is over. On Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda doesn't get the memo. By this point, he's deep in the jungle with a small group of soldiers. Allied forces have taken the island. Most Japanese soldiers on Lubang either surrendered or were killed. But Onoda and his small unit, 3 other men, retreat into the mountains and the dense jungle interior. Then leaflets start appearing, dropped from aircraft, left in the jungle. They say the war is over. Japan has surrendered. Soldiers should come out. Onoda looks at those leaflets and concludes they are Allied propaganda, a psychological operation designed to make Japanese soldiers give up without a fight. He had been trained at Nakano to expect exactly this kind of deception. The enemy would try to break your will. They would lie. They would fake surrender announcements. He would not be fooled. In October 1945, official Japanese surrender documents were dropped from planes over the island. Onoda read them. He decided they were forgeries. Newspapers were left in the jungle. Photographs, announcements. Onoda examined each one carefully and reached the same conclusion every time. This is enemy propaganda. The war continues. And so he continued. He and his remaining soldiers kept living in the jungle. They ate what they could find: bananas, coconuts, whatever they could steal from local farms. They maintained their weapons, they stayed on patrol, they continued their mission, because as far as Hiroo Onoda was concerned, the war was still going. The years passed. One by one, his companions either surrendered or were killed. The first, Uchiha Katsu, slipped away from the group in 1949 and surrendered to Philippine forces after 6 years in the jungle. He was sent home to Japan. The second, Shoichi Shimada, was shot and killed in a skirmish with a Philippine search party in 1954, 9 years after the war ended. The third, Kinshichi Ikozuka, was killed by Philippine police in 1972, 27 years after the war ended, during a raid on a supply of rice he and Onoda had been stealing. And then there was one, Onoda, alone, in the jungle, still on patrol, still fighting. The Philippine government knew he was out there. Onoda had become something of a known phenomenon by the 1970s, a ghost in the jungle, occasionally seen, occasionally responsible for small acts of sabotage or confrontations with locals. By this point, 30 Filipino civilians had been killed in encounters with Onoda and his group over the decades. For the locals of Lubang, this was not a historical curiosity. It was a live threat. The Philippine and Japanese governments had made multiple attempts to reach him. His own family members had traveled to the island and called out to him through loudspeakers in the jungle. Former Japanese officers had come to try to persuade him. Onoda heard them. He didn't trust them. Every attempt to reach him could, in his framework, be an enemy trick. His training told him, the enemy will try everything to break you. They will use familiar voices. They will forge documents. They will send people who look like people you know. He stayed. The sheer psychological discipline involved is almost incomprehensible. Nearly 3 decades of sleeping in the jungle, Constant vigilance, constant threat, awareness. No confirmation that anything you believe is real, and yet absolute certainty that your mission is still valid. His training had not just given him skills, it had given him an unshakable reality, and nothing from the outside world could penetrate it, because his training had specifically prepared him to reject everything from the outside world. It took another Japanese man to end it. Not a soldier, not a government official, a young adventurer named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was 24 years old in 1974. He was traveling the world, and he had announced somewhat casually that he was going to find three things: Hiroo Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. In that order. He flew to the Philippines, he went to Lubang Island, he walked into the jungle and started looking, and after a few days, he found Onoda, not through some elaborate operation, not through military planning. He just walked in and started calling out. He left notes, he set up a camp, and eventually Onoda appeared, rifle in hand, uniform worn but intact, still very much a soldier. Suzuki didn't try to convince Onoda the war was over. He had the sense to realize that wouldn't work. Instead, he talked to him, he listened to him, he treated him with respect, and then he asked, "What would it take for you to come out?" Onoda's answer was simple and completely consistent with everything he'd ever believed. "Orders from my commanding officer." Suzuki went back to Japan. He tracked down Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Tonoguchi, who was by then retired and working as a bookseller, and he brought Tonoguchi back to Lubang Island. On March 9, 1974, Major Tonoguchi walked into the jungle and found Hiroo Onoda. He formally relieved him of duty. He read him the official orders. The war had ended in 1945. His mission was over. He was to disarm and come out. Onoda stood at attention. He listened. And then for the first time in 29 years, he followed orders to stop fighting. He was 52 years old. Onoda emerged from the jungle still carrying his functioning Arisaka rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a sword, all in working condition. He had maintained his weapons for nearly 3 decades in tropical humidity. He was flown back to Japan, expecting, he later said, to face punishment, to be seen as a failure, to be judged for what he'd done or hadn't done. Instead, Japan received him as a hero, massive crowds, media coverage across the world. He was pardoned by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos for the deaths that had occurred during his 3 decades of continued fighting. But Onoda himself was conflicted, deeply conflicted. He had come home to a Japan he didn't recognize. The country had been rebuilt from rubble into an economic powerhouse. The values and the culture he had gone to war to defend felt distant. He found the Japan of 1974 prosperous, westernized, and at peace, alienating. It was a shock, he later said. Japan had changed completely. I could not adjust. He moved to Brazil, where he ran a cattle ranch for years. He eventually returned to Japan and spent the rest of his life running a nature school for young people, teaching wilderness survival, discipline, and what he called the values that modern Japan had forgotten. He never expressed regret for his years in the jungle. He expressed regret for the lives lost. But the mission itself, the dedication, the discipline, the refusal to break, he stood by it until the end. Hiroo Onoda's story is easy to frame as an oddity, a punchline, almost the soldier who didn't know the war was over. But that framing misses what's actually remarkable about him. Onoda didn't stay in the jungle because he was delusional. He stayed because his belief system was internally consistent and his training had made it impenetrable. Every piece of evidence that the war was over could be reinterpreted, within his framework, as enemy deception. He wasn't irrational, he was, in a terrible way, perfectly rational within a reality that had stopped being real in 1945. It raises a question that goes well beyond one man in one jungle. How many of our certainties, the frameworks we use to interpret the world, the training we received, the things we were told were absolutely true, are we still fighting for, long after the war that created them has ended? Hiroo Onoda died in January 2014. He was 91 years old. He had lived more of his life as a soldier in a war that no longer existed than as anything else. He was loyal to the end. The question history leaves open is, loyal to what?